There's a feeling that shows up right before your life falls into place, and almost nobody recognizes it for what it is. It doesn't announce itself as momentum or excitement or the sense that you're finally getting somewhere. It arrives as a strange, flat quiet, the kind that feels less like a beginning and more like being forgotten by the universe. Carl Jung noticed this pattern over and over in the people who came to him, and it disturbed him how consistent it was. The individuals whose lives were about to reorganize in the most profound way almost always described the period right before it as the emptiest, most uncertain, most nothing is happening stretch they had ever lived through. They didn't feel like they were on the verge of anything. They felt stuck, passed over, like they'd been left behind while everyone else moved forward. And that was precisely the feeling, Jung came to believe, that tends to find a person in the final stretch before everything clicks. He described it to himself once using an image that stayed with him. Picture standing under a night sky crowded with stars. On their own, those points of light mean nothing. Scattered dots thrown across the dark with no order to them, no shape, no story. And then something in your position shifts, just slightly, and the same scattered points suddenly resolve into a figure, a pattern that was there the entire time, but that your eyes couldn't assemble until this exact moment. Jung believed a human life passes through thresholds like this, long stretches where all the scattered pieces are already in position, already arranged, already complete. The only thing missing is the shift in perspective that lets you finally see the shape they were forming all along. Jung spent the last decades of his life studying what he called synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences that seem to cluster around people at certain turning points. He noticed that events in a person's outer world and movements in their inner world would sometimes line up in ways that pure chance couldn't explain. And he found that these clusters tended to intensify right before a major reorganization of someone's life, as if the inner and outer were beginning to rhyme, as if something beneath the surface was aligning the pieces before the person had any conscious idea it was happening. Today I want to walk you through what Jung understood about this in-between place, why the moment right before things fall into place so often feels like the moment they'll never fall into place at all. What's actually happening beneath the surface during that flat, quiet, forgotten stretch? The specific signs that you're standing in it right now, and why the very thing you're doing to try to force your life forward might be the one thing keeping the pattern from revealing itself. Because if you're in a season where you've done the work, made the changes, put in the years, and still nothing seems to be moving, still the results haven't come, still you're waking up wondering whether any of it mattered, Jung would tell you not to trust that appearance. What looks like a dead end from the inside is very often the last few feet of a tunnel you're about to walk out of. Let me start with why this stretch feels so wrong. Most people assume that inner change and outer change happen at the same time. You do the internal work, and your circumstances update to match. You heal something, and the world reflects it back immediately. But Jung observed that the psyche doesn't operate on that schedule. There's a lag, a gap between the moment you become someone new on the inside and the moment your life on the outside catches up to it. And that gap is where almost everyone loses faith. Think about what it means to genuinely change at the core. You spend years, maybe your whole life, organized around a particular set of fears, a particular way of protecting yourself, a particular story about who you are and what you're allowed to have. And then, slowly, through pain or reflection or sheer exhaustion, that organization starts to dissolve. You stop needing the approval you used to chase. You stop tolerating what you used to accept. You stop performing the version of yourself that everyone got comfortable with. Something real settles into place underneath. But your circumstances were all built for the old you. Your relationships were calibrated to who you were. Your routines, your work, Your entire external life is still shaped around a person who no longer fully exists. So, there's this eerie period where you've already changed, but nothing around you reflects it yet. You feel different, but your life looks the same. And the mind reads that mismatch as failure. It concludes that the change didn't take, that the work was for nothing, that you're right back where you started. Jung would say, you've got it exactly backwards. The mismatch isn't evidence that nothing happened. It's evidence that everything happened, on the inside, and the outside simply hasn't been rearranged to match yet. You're living in the delay between cause and effect, and the delay is uncomfortable precisely because you can feel the new self pressing against a life that no longer fits it, like water building behind a wall that hasn't broken yet. This is the flat quiet, the forgotten stretch. And here's the cruel irony Jung kept running into. This period tends to arrive right after a person has done the hardest part of the work. They've faced what they needed to face. They've let go of what they needed to release. They've become, quietly, the person they were trying to become. And their reward, in the short term, is a stretch of profound nothing. No fireworks, no obvious payoff, just a strange stillness where the striving used to be. That stillness is one of the first signs that you're closer than you think. Because there's a specific quality to the calm that settles over a person right before their life reorganizes. It's not the calm of resignation, though it can be mistaken for it. It's not giving up. It's something closer to the fight simply going out of you, the compulsive, grasping, white-knuckle effort you'd been pouring into forcing your life forward, finally loosening its grip. You stop trying so hard. And not because you've decided to. Something in you just can't sustain the striving anymore, and in its place comes a quiet you don't quite trust. Jung watched people mistake this quiet for depression constantly. And sometimes it genuinely was. But often it was something else entirely. The psyche conserving its energy, pulling back from the exhausting project of controlling everything, and redirecting that energy toward the deep, invisible work of reorganization. You feel flat because the part of you that used to generate all that anxious motion has gone quiet. And into that silence, something new is being assembled. The second sign is stranger, and it's the one Jung found most compelling. The coincidences start multiplying. You think about someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they message you that afternoon. A book falls into your hands with the exact sentence you needed to read. You take a wrong turn and end up in a conversation that changes your entire trajectory. A phrase keeps showing up, in a song, in a stranger's remark, in a dream, as if the world is trying to underline something. These are the synchronicities Jung spent his final years studying, and he found that they cluster most densely around people who are approaching a threshold. He didn't think this was magic. He thought it was meaning becoming visible. When your inner life is reorganizing at a deep level, he believed, you start perceiving the connections between things that were always there, but that you'd been too preoccupied to notice. The world doesn't necessarily change. Your capacity to read it changes. The scattered points of light begin, faintly, to suggest a shape. And you find yourself feeling, against all logic, that something is being arranged on your behalf. Most people dismiss these moments. They call them coincidence and move on. But Jung would tell you to pay attention when they start piling up, because their frequency is a kind of signal. It means the gap between your inner and outer worlds is beginning to close. It means the pattern is starting to surface. The third sign is the one that scares people. Your old desires stop working. The things you used to want with your whole chest, the goal you'd organized years around, the relationship you thought would complete you, the version of success you were chasing, suddenly go quiet. You reach for the old hunger and find it isn't there anymore. And this is terrifying, because those desires were the engine. They were what got you out of bed. Without them, you feel unmoored, purposeless, like you've lost the plot of your own life. Jung understood this as the psyche clearing the field. Those old desires belong to the person you used to be, and that person is dissolving. The new desires, the ones that belong to who you're actually becoming, haven't fully arrived yet. So you're caught in the gap again, wanting nothing, unable to manufacture the old motivation, waiting for a new one that hasn't declared itself. And the temptation in that gap is enormous. The temptation is to grab the old desire and force it back to life, to recommit to the goal that no longer moves you, just to feel the comfort of wanting something familiar again. But the emptiness where the old wants used to be isn't a malfunction. It's a space being cleared. Something more genuine is going to fill it, but only if you can tolerate the emptiness long enough for it to arrive on its own terms. This is the exact point where most people sabotage the thing that's trying to happen. They can't stand the not knowing. They can't sit in the quiet where the striving used to be. So they reach backward. They restart the engine on a desire that had rightfully died. They cling to the old shape of their life because the space between shapes feels unbearable. And in doing so, they interrupt the reorganization at the precise moment it was about to complete. Jung watched this happen with real sorrow. He saw people who were one season away from everything falling into place, and they couldn't wait that one season. They forced a resolution. They took the familiar road because the unfamiliar quiet frightened them. And they spent years afterward with a vague, aching sense that they'd turned away from something right before it arrived. If you're in that quiet right now, if you've done the work and you're standing in the flat, uncertain stretch where nothing seems to be moving and the old wants have gone silent, there's a resource I want to point you toward. We've put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's approach, built for exactly this in-between place. Not to rush you out of the quiet, but to help you read what's happening inside it, to notice the pattern beginning to form while there's still only scattered light. The link is right below this video. Now let me show you what's actually happening beneath the surface while you wait. Here's the part Jung found hardest to convey to his more rational colleagues, because it sounded almost mystical, even though he insisted it wasn't. He came to believe that the psyche has an ordering principle at its center, something deeper than the conscious mind, deeper than the ego, that moves a person's life toward wholeness, whether the ego cooperates or not. He called this center the self, and he found that when a person stops fighting it, stops trying to force their life into a shape the ego finds acceptable, this deeper center begins to arrange things with a kind of intelligence the conscious mind could never have planned. You can see the fingerprints of it afterward, he said, but never during. Looking back on a life that finally came together, people would describe a chain of events that seemed almost designed. The job they didn't get that freed them for the one that mattered. The relationship that ended just in time, the failure that redirected them toward the exact right door. From inside the moment, each of these felt like loss or confusion or dead end. From the vantage point of the whole pattern, they revealed themselves as the necessary steps of something being assembled with care. And here's the mechanism that most people never understand. The ordering principle works best when the ego gets out of its way. When you're gripping your life tightly, forcing it toward the outcome you've decided on, you override the deeper intelligence. You keep insisting the constellation should form a particular shape, and you refuse to see the shape it's actually forming. But when the striving finally exhausts itself, when you reach that flat quiet, that loosening of the grip, the deeper center is finally free to arrange things according to a pattern larger than your conscious preferences. This is why the falling into place so often happens right after you stop trying to make it happen. Not because effort is bad, but because a certain kind of desperate, controlling effort actively blocks the reorganization. The muddy water doesn't clear while you keep stirring it, insisting on clarity, churning it with your demand to see the bottom. It clears when you finally let it sit still. And in the stillness, everything that was suspended and chaotic settles, on its own, into its proper place. Jung wasn't telling people to be passive. He was telling them there's a difference between action that flows from the deeper center and frantic motion that flows from fear. The person right before their life comes together often has to learn, sometimes for the first time, how to stop the frantic motion, how to trust that the stillness isn't stagnation, how to let the water settle instead of stirring it out of anxiety. Let me make this concrete because it's easy to nod along and still not feel it. Picture someone who spent a decade trying to force a particular life into existence. They knew exactly what it was supposed to look like, the career, the partner, the sense of having arrived. And they worked for it relentlessly, controlling every variable they could reach, pushing against every obstacle, refusing to let up. And year after year it stayed just out of reach. The harder they pushed, the more it slipped. They started to believe something was wrong with them, that they'd been passed over, that the thing they wanted simply wasn't meant for people like them. And then one ordinary week, no dramatic breakdown, no cinematic collapse, just a slow exhaustion that finally hit bottom. They stopped. Not out of wisdom, out of depletion. They simply couldn't keep pushing. They let the goal go slack. They stopped auditioning for the life they'd been chasing and started living in the quiet that remained. And that quiet felt, at first, like defeat. Like they'd finally given up on themselves. Within months, the thing they'd chased for 10 years began to appear, but sideways, through a door they'd never thought to try, in a form slightly different from the one they'd imagined, and somehow better than the version they'd been forcing. A conversation led somewhere. A person they'd almost never met turned out to matter. A no they'd received a year earlier revealed itself as the thing that had cleared space for this. Looking back, they could trace the whole pattern. From inside it, they'd felt nothing but stuck. That's the shape of it more often than not. The falling into place tends to arrive through the door you weren't guarding, in a season you'd written off, right after you stopped forcing the front entrance. Now here's something Jung was careful about, because it would be easy to twist this into a fantasy that everything works out if you just relax. He never promised outcomes. He wasn't selling the idea that the universe hands you your wishes if you wait patiently enough. What he observed was subtler and, in a way, more trustworthy than that. He observed that when a person stops forcing their life into the ego's preferred shape and lets the deeper center do its work, what falls into place is rarely what the ego wanted, and almost always more real than what the ego wanted. The person doesn't get the life they were performing for, they get the life that actually fits who they've become, and those are different things. The ego chases a picture assembled from other people's expectations, from old wounds, from the desperate need to prove something. The deeper center moves toward wholeness, toward the life in which you no longer have to perform, no longer have to prove, no longer have to grip. So when things finally fall into place, there's often a strange double sensation. Part of you is startled because it looks nothing like the plan, and part of you recognizes it instantly because it feels like coming home to something you somehow always knew. That recognition is the whole point. Jung believed the reason it feels like everything falls into place, rather than gets built or gets achieved, is that the pieces were yours all along. You weren't constructing a new life from scratch. You were letting the scattered parts of a life that was always meant to be yours finally assemble into their pattern. The falling into place isn't the arrival of something foreign, it's the recognition of something native. The stars were never rearranged. Your eyes finally learned to see the figure they'd been forming the whole time. This is why the moment of falling into place often comes with tears that aren't sadness and aren't quite joy. People describe it as relief so deep it feels like grief, as if they're mourning all the years they spent believing the pattern wasn't there, all the nights they lay awake convinced they'd been forgotten, when in fact the pieces were already in position, waiting only for the shift in perspective that would let them see it. So let me speak to you directly. If you're somewhere in the flat quiet right now, you've probably been told in one form or another that your life stalling is your fault. That if you just tried harder, wanted it more, optimized better, you'd be further along by now. And maybe you've internalized that so completely that the stillness you're in feels like an accusation. Every quiet day feels like proof you're failing. Every stretch of nothing happening feels like evidence you've been left behind. Jung would ask you to consider a different reading, that the stillness isn't punishment for not trying hard enough. It might be the natural consequence of having tried hard enough, of having done the deep work, of having finally reached the place where the striving can rest. That the flatness you feel is the water settling, not the water going dry. That the coincidences you keep dismissing are the pattern beginning to surface. That the death of your old desires is a field being cleared for something truer to grow. And he'd ask you to notice the specific temptation you're facing right now, the pull to interrupt the process, the urge to grab the old goal and force it back to life, the urge to run back to the relationship or the role or the identity that had rightfully started to dissolve. The urge to stir the water because you can't stand not seeing the bottom yet. That urge is the single most common way people turn away from their lives right before those lives fall into place. And the antidote isn't more effort. It's the harder discipline of staying still, of tolerating the not knowing for one more season, of trusting that the deeper center is arranging something your conscious mind couldn't have designed. This kind of trust doesn't come naturally to most of us because we've been taught that trust means passivity, and passivity means losing. But there's a difference between the passivity of despair and the stillness of a person who has done their work and is now letting it settle. The first has given up on the pattern. The second is watching for it to emerge. From the outside, they can look identical. Someone sitting quietly, not forcing, not grasping. From the inside, they're opposite. One has stopped believing the stars form anything. The other is still looking up, patient, waiting for the figure to resolve. Jung lived through his own version of this. There was a long stretch in his life where he withdrew from the frantic ambition that had driven his early career, where he stopped forcing his ideas onto the world and turned inward instead, into a period he found frightening and disorienting and slow. His colleagues saw a man who'd lost his momentum. He experienced years of not knowing where any of it was leading, and it was precisely out of that stillness, that willingness to stop forcing and let the deeper material assemble itself, that the entire body of work he's now known for finally took shape. The falling into place came after the withdrawal, not before it, and it looked nothing like the life he would have designed for himself. It was larger. Here's what I most want you to carry away from this. The feeling that finds you right before everything comes together is almost never the feeling you'd expect. You expect it to feel like acceleration, like clarity, like the sudden lifting of fog. Instead, it tends to feel like a long, quiet, uncertain stretch where you've stopped fighting and haven't yet been rewarded, where the old wants have gone silent and the new ones haven't spoken, where you feel less like you're arriving and more like you've been forgotten. And that feeling, that exact uncomfortable in-between feeling, is one of the most reliable signs Jung ever found that a life is about to reorganize. If that's where you are, you don't need to do more. You've likely already done the part that mattered. What's being asked of you now is something quieter and, in its own way, much harder. To stay in the stillness without stirring it. To let the water settle. To keep looking up at the scattered light without insisting it hurry, trusting that the shift in perspective is coming, and that when it does, you'll see the shape that was there the entire time. Because the pieces are already in place. That's the thing almost nobody believes while they're inside the waiting. The relationship that will matter, the work that will fit, the version of you that finally feels like home. The raw material of all of it is already present, already arranged, already yours. What hasn't happened yet is the recognition. The moment the scattered points resolve into the figure. And that moment tends to arrive not when you force it, but when you finally stop forcing and let yourself see. You've been staring at scattered stars, convinced they mean nothing, convinced you were left out of whatever pattern everyone else seems to be living inside. But the same points of light that look like random chaos from one angle become a clear and undeniable shape from another. Nothing about the sky has to change, only your position. Only the slight, quiet shift that turns a field of loose dots into the picture they were always spelling out. That shift is close. Closer than the flat quiet would ever let you believe. And when it comes, when the pattern finally surfaces and you see how each scattered, confusing, dead-end piece was in position the whole time, you won't feel like you built something new. You'll feel like you finally recognize something that was always waiting for you to look up. Stay in the stillness a little longer. Let the water settle. Keep looking at the light. The shape is forming, whether you can see it yet or not, and everything you've been through was the slow work of arranging it. What finds you right before your life falls into place isn't triumph or certainty. It's a quiet that asks you to trust. And on the other side of that trust is the moment the whole constellation comes clear. If you haven't yet, take a look at our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built for exactly the kind of stillness you might be standing in right now. A way to read the pattern while it's still forming, instead of stirring the water out of fear. The link is right below this video.